it's very hard to be a parent. Parents are making the best decisions that they can based on their own family traumas or histories. Parents have to be compassionate to their children when they're adult children, talk about what was hurtful or problematic about their parenting or their relationship. There's been kind of a sea change in how we think about family in the past half century. Prior to that, the model was honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, families forever. Sometimes parents make the mistake of they'll try to guilt trip their adult child and say, owe me this respect, or you owe me a relationship, or after all I've done for you. And that ship has sailed. That just doesn't work. It actually makes the adult child turn away even more. Making your child feel guilty or like they owe it to you, it's just not going to be a motivator. The old days of honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders no matter what they do, and that's just not true anymore. And parents have to kind of get with the program.
Welcome back, everyone, to Diary of an Empath. Today's guest is Dr. Josh Coleman, a renowned psychologist and author of The Rules of Estrangement, Why Adult Children Cut Ties, and How to Heal Conflict. Dr. Coleman is a leading voice on family relationships and has written extensively on the complexities of estrangement and conflict within families. Dr. Coleman, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I really think that this is an interesting and important topic. I will admit I've had a lot of people on my show to talk about the other side of the coin on why do we cut off our parents? When should we cut off our parents? But I really believe in also seeing all sides and trying to gain a better perspective on what that looks like for all parties involved, just so we can understand ourselves and know if we're making the right decision. With your book, I know that you wrote this with a certain intention, and I would love to know, when people read your book and they listen to podcasts like this, what do you want them to take away from this?
Well, I guess there's lots of things to take away. I mean, one is, first of all, that it's very hard to be a parent, and that parenting often occurs in a kind of a fog of war where parents are making the best decisions that they can based on their own family traumas or histories, what their own childhood was like, their socioeconomic class, their genetics, who their children were, how challenging they were. And so sometimes when adult children go to estrange a parent, I think they sort of assume that the parent was acting with more sort of conscious negative intent than they really were. I don't think anybody sets out to hurt their children, even when parents are truly hurtful. So that in the same way that I think that parents have to be compassionate to their children when they're adult children, talk about what was hurtful or problematic about their parenting or their relationship, I think it's important that adult children are able to try to see their parent with a certain degree of compassion and that the parent, even when they made serious mistakes, were doing the best that they could given their own histories and temperament.
I think that books like yours, and I'm going to name drop another book, It Didn't Start With You. These types of books, I think, have really changed my outlook on understanding that exactly what you said. There are so many things that I think come into play with resources, socioeconomic status, finances, trauma. And sometimes parents just don't have the resources or the capability of being the parents that we now are capable of being maybe in our lifetime.
Right. Yeah.
When you wrote this book and many others before this, how would you define your mission?
Well, it's really to give parents the tools, kind of to what you're talking about, because I think that a lot of the estrangements that happen, in the same way that a lot of marriages or romantic relationships fail because the people don't know how to communicate their feelings or how to resolve conflict, it was really to give parents the tools to understand what their adult child is intending when they talk about the history of emotional abuse or other traumas or where they felt neglected or harmed. So often the generations are talking past each other, and younger generations are more kind of informed psychologically, and they have a kind of a more, detailed language about trauma and abuse and the like. And parents often came from very different generations where parents weren't expected to do quite as much or be as psychological. So it's really giving parents the tools to be able to communicate with their estranged children, adult children, to help them feel cared about and understood and move the relationship towards reconciliation.
So when we're talking about estrangement, how would you define that? Are we talking just I'm done, we're not talking anymore, and we have no contact, or are there different types of estrangement?
Yeah, I would consider estrangement to be a no contact kind of a relationship. And probably if you're, the only time you hear from your adult child is, maybe for your birthday or Mother's Day. But other than that, they don't return calls or emails and you're blocked on social media and, nothing that you send out to them gets returned. I would also consider that an estrangement.
Okay, so you talked about societal shifts, and I thought that this was interesting. So explain to me, what do you mean by how societal changes can impact family dynamics? Can they impact family dynamics?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's been kind of a sea change in how we think about family in the past half century. So, for example, prior to that, the model was honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, families forever. And that gave way, in the 1960s to 70s of much more the idea that for younger generations to is more about protecting their mental health and their happiness, and that relationships have to occur in the context of growth and personal fulfillment. The idea that it, shifted more towards respect is earned, it's not granted. So today, nothing compels an adult child to be in a relationship with a parent beyond that adult child's desire. So sometimes parents make the mistake of, feeling like they'll try to guilt trip their adult child and say, well, you owe me this respect, or you owe me a relationship, or after all I've done for you. And that ship is
Yes.
sailed. That just doesn't work. It actually makes the adult child turn away even more. So seeing that relationships between parents and adult children are similar to romantic relationships, and that is that they have to be based around good communication and a certain degree of psychological awareness, that sort of thing.
Okay, why doesn't it work? Because you're absolutely right. I hear this a lot. I've been through it in my own personal life of I'm the parent, you're the child. This is the dynamic. You should respect me no matter how old you are. Doesn't matter if I'm right or wrong. You should respect me. And you're right, it doesn't work. Why?
Well, because the culture has changed. So, it works in cultures and in societies where filial obligation, say, is more of the culture, say in South and East Asian societies, for example, their parents can kind of demand more because part of the larger culture supports that. But in Western individualistic countries, of which the United States is the most individualistic, it doesn't work because there's so much support, social support, not to do it. People get support from their therapists or their peers or online or Instagram influencers. So adult children just have a freer reign to say, no, this is the kind of relationship I want. You need to be respectful of my boundaries and my limits, and you need to take responsibility for the ways that you hurt me as a child, or I'm not going to play ball with you.
So isn't that a good thing then? Would you say is there nuances to that, or are we shifting to something that's maybe more positive and just letting go of these outdated ways of framework of how we see parent and child dynamics?
Yeah, no, it's a good news, bad news thing. The good news is, yes, people do have a richer, more detailed language to push back against abusive, difficult, challenging, controlling, shaming parents, and to actually end relationships with people who are just, very destructive to their happiness and self-esteem and well-being. And so that's the good news. The bad news is that, in sort of giving people permission to do this, it now gets cast as a sort of um, positive in ways that isn't necessarily positive for that person, and that people are cutting off parents who are much more workable than they're sort of being led to believe, and that often parents just lack the tools towards reconciliation, and that sometimes the language of abuse and harm and trauma really get overused in our society. And also similarly with diagnosis. Oh, you're a narcissist, you're a borderline, you're a gaslighter. And all of that can infect family relationships and make people feel like they have a stronger case against the parent than they really should have. So that's sort of the downside, that a certain percentage of estrangements happen with parents who are, quite workable and willing to go to therapy, willing to do family therapy, and but they're being told, no, you're a narcissist, you'll never change, or you traumatized me for things which are, questionable in terms of truly being traumatic. Trauma is grossly overused these days. So that's the downside of the change.
Well, let's look at the positive side, because then you have parents, and you're right, there are parents that I think are willing to see or willing to work through things or wanting to work through it, but maybe just don't know how.
Right.
You also have parents who are unwilling to change, unwilling to take accountability, unwilling to go to therapy, unwilling to say, this was my part in this and this is why, and this is where my willingness is. It's just, I'm wrong, right? You're wrong, very black and white. So are people walking away too soon? Is no contact the only way forward? Or are there positive things about family estrangement and new societal shifts that we're having?
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think that it can be a positive if your parent is completely unrepentant. They're not willing to work on their communication. They're not willing to do their own therapy or family therapy. They insist that it's kind of their way or the highway. They continue to behave or interact with you in a way that's shaming and hurtful and rejecting and humiliating. I can't conscientiously, as a psychologist, encourage somebody to keep going back to that poisonous well. So it is a positive that people can separate themselves from really destructive family members. In the same way, it's positive that with the liberalization of divorce laws, that people don't have to stay in abusive marriages. So yeah, no, I don't think everybody is obligated to it. I do think that sometimes people don't give the parent enough help in understanding, or give them things to read, or to, offer therapy, or empathize with how hard it is for a parent to adopt this newer psychological kind of way of communicating that wasn't as true in their generation.
I've come very far in terms of my thinking and my programming on how I view my relationship with my parents. And, it was before they traumatized me, they invalidated me, and this is what it is. I think I've grown to understand that our realities are different for different reasons. Their belief system and their resources, their ability to be a parent was much different than my resources and my ability to be a parent. We have internet, we have social media, we have so many free options, and it's not as stigmatized anymore. So when you talk about separate realities in every family, help me to understand that. So if I'm just listening to this for the first time and I'm like, no, I'm right, they're wrong. How would you explain separate realities to someone who's listening to that?
Yeah, separate realities is the idea that a parent could sort of objectively look like they were doing a good job, and their child could still feel like they really missed something important about them, or that was really hurtful to them. Sometimes parents sort of overcorrect. If you were raised with neglectful parents, maybe you were really involved as a parent, but your kid experienced you as not having any boundaries and being really intrusive and controlling. Or if you had really controlling, intrusive parents, maybe you overcorrected by being, really laissez-faire, and your kid felt like you were neglectful. So, so I think both are realities, and I think that the conflict resolution comes from people being able to empathize with why people did the way that why they behaved in the ways that they did. So if you're the adult child, to try to view your parent with a certain degree of empathy, even if the way that they behaved towards you was hurtful to you, there was a reason that they behaved in the way that they did, and to try to understand that and to not personalize it as much.
I'm also hearing on the flip side of the coin for a parent, right? To understand that your child's reality might be different. And because we hear, I did the best that I can, I did the best that I can.
Right.
But
Yeah.
oftentimes I find that I think what a lot of people want is just accountability, empathy, and validation, right? Yes, I did the best that I can, but I also acknowledge that those things weren't what you needed at that time, or that you needed a different version of me.
No, I think it's key, and that's really at the center of my strategies for parents, is that they have to empathize, they have to take responsibility. They shouldn't defend or explain, or I don't even think parents should say I did the best that I could, because it sounds defensive. I think they're better off just really going directly to what did feel hurtful or traumatizing or upsetting to the child, and really deepening their understanding and showing curiosity and care and regret about that. So no, I think it's really at the heart of my recommendations for parents.
The 5 most common beliefs that interfere with making amends. You talk about this with your book, and I would love for you to talk a little bit about this, of what are some common beliefs that prevent us from healing this relationship. If you had to name your top 3, what would they be?
Well, if you're the parent, I think it's just hard for parents to face the ways that we let down our children or hurt them, and often the child's version may be really different. So, kind of getting into their perspective rather than your own as a parent can be really challenging. So if your parents said you emotionally abused me and you don't feel like a parent that you did, it can be really challenging to find that space. And part of what makes it challenging is no parent wants to feel like they failed their child, and so that can make it really hard for parents to make amends. Some parents just don't have the language, as we've been talking about, to communicate their feelings in a way that causes the adult child to feel cared about and understood. Parents who've been through their own childhood traumas just may carry more shame already into parenting before they even became parents. They may feel like there's something inherently wrong or flawed about them. So when their now adult child says, yeah, you failed me or let me down or hurt me, it may be hard to face that or take responsibility because it just feels like it's holding a mirror up to how undeserving of love and care they have because they already feel that way as a result of their childhoods. So I think that those are really big obstacles. I think, part of what's also hard for parents is I think a lot of parents could get to, I feel I can understand how that was hurtful, but I think the second part of it that makes it hard is, but I don't see why you have to estrange me over it. So I think that can be an obstacle as well, that it's hard for parents to sort of see why that has led to an estrangement.
I think a lot of people maybe misunderstand that for some people, this level of chaos, let's just say you lived in a chaotic household. For some, that's normal. If they grew up in a chaotic household and this is how they were parented, for some people that is their baseline, that becomes normal. And so to now confront that and say, no, that's not normal. Like, for example, let's say you grew up in a chaotic household and you start going over to your friend's house and you start seeing like, okay, these households are different than mine. Something's not right here, right? You start to grow up, you see that things are different outside of your own household, but meanwhile your mom, your dad, your parents, or whoever your caregivers are just stuck in this like almost cognitive dissonance of like, no, you had a fine childhood. I provided, I gave you food. So that really comes to my question of, and this is where I struggle. Are there some parents that, and this may not be a black and white answer, but are there some parents that just don't want to see? Do they really just don't understand it? Or do they just not care or are completely unwilling to see it?
Well, I think for those who are unwilling to see it, there's a number of reasons why they'd be unwilling. One is that it's too painful to face the reality that they hurt their child. They may have repressed how painful it was for them to have grown up in a chaotic environment, and they don't want to, they can't face it. So the child saying that this is painful to them reminds them of their own memories that are probably unconscious at that point about how painful it is. I think it's very hard for parents to really acknowledge how deeply they've hurt their child, particularly if it's resulted in an estrangement, but even well before it comes into an estrangement. Because a lot of estrangement happens because the adult child might not start out wanting to be estranged. They might start out saying, well, I've learned that, in therapy that we grew up in a chaotic household and this affected my self-esteem and my confidence. And when the parent says, oh, you're full of crap, you want to see a chaotic household, you should have grown up with the parents that I grew up with. And the parents may have indeed provided a much better childhood than was provided to them. So they may feel like, no, this was actually a good childhood in comparison, but it could still be well below the bar of what that child needed. And it could have still been very hurtful and disruptive or even destructive to that child, even if it was better than the childhood that was provided to them as the parent. So I think all those things can really make it harder for the parent to do the work that adult children reasonably want them to do.
It's interesting you brought up comparisons. I just wrote that down right before you answered this question. It brings up a really good point on, well, I had a worse childhood than you. You have it better than I did. When I was growing up, I never did this to my parents and you treat me horribly. Is comparisons harmful? Because I feel like we hear this theme a lot. I grew up with that. My mom was like, I never did this to my mom. I would never talk to my mom like this. And it's just like, okay,
Exactly.
well, I'm not you, you know?
Right. Yeah. Different time, different generation, different culture.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that, we all have our own childhood backgrounds as sort of the template that we experience ourselves as parents, and whether we're doing a better job or a worse job. I mean, I'm a boomer, so I grew up sort of in an era of, my parents were fairly hands off, but they were pretty reasonable as people. But I grew up in an era where parents were much more hands on, and, we worried more about outdoor play and kidnappings, and, probably wrongly, but we had very different childhoods. And I just think your own childhood is such a big template for how you judge your own behavior, what to expect of your own children. And that can either be an asset or a liability, depending what your childhood was like.
Okay, so someone's listening right now. They want to make amends and they want to reconnect with their adult child. You talk about the importance of letter amends as a potential way for parents to reach out to their estranged children. How does this work and what makes this effective? And if somebody's listening and it's like, I want to do this, what are your big things like to say, stay away from in this letter and focus on this?
Right. Well, they should read my book, Rules of Estrangement, because I have a whole section on that. Not to
Mm-hmm.
not to plug
Oh
the
no,
book
plug it in. Plug it in.
But letters of amends could be very powerful, but they have to be done the right way. So the right way, I always encourage parents to start off by saying, I know you wouldn't have cut off contact unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do, because I think that from the adult child's perspective, that is how they feel. Now, the parent might not feel that way, but the adult child feels that way. And it's a way to sort of signal, okay, I'm not going to treat this like you're just victimizing me. And I'm not just going to be a martyr about the fact that you don't want to have contact. I'm not going to accuse you of being selfish or mean or cruel. I'm going to get on the same page with you and say that I know you're doing this, it's for your own self-protection. I mean, that's just, I've had seen a number of letters from adult children who said it was that sentence that caused me to be more open to being back in contact with you. But then the parent has to follow up with really addressing what the child's complaints were. They don't always know, but if they have heard, then they have to find a way of empathizing with it. So let's say the child says, well, you were emotionally abusive to me. And the parent doesn't really feel like they were emotionally abusive. Then the parent still has to say, well, it's clear that I have significant blind spots, that I don't have a better, I wasn't aware that felt emotionally abusive to you, but I'm glad that you let me know. And it's something that I can work on either in my own therapy or together with you in therapy going forward. If there are other things that have bothered you about the past that you want me to work on or you want to talk about, I promise to listen in order to understand and not be defensive. If you want to do family therapy, I would welcome that as well. So it's a big sort of a full taking of responsibility. The things that parents shouldn't do is they shouldn't be defensive. They shouldn't explain, well, I did the best that I could, or maybe I wasn't perfect, but I did, give you a roof over the home and you had a much better childhood than I did. Shouldn't blame other people. Well, it's your dad's fault. It's your mom's fault. Shouldn't blame the kid. Well, you had ADD, you had addictions, you had mental health issues. They shouldn't get mad. How dare you, cut off contact after everything I've done for you. It has to be sort of a pure act of love and compassion and empathy and responsibility taking. And they're not easy letters to write, but they're critically important letters to write.
Okay, I'm going to challenge this a little bit.
Challenge away.
What if you have a parent who is the unwilling, not taking accountability because they have their own version, their own belief system for many different reasons, trauma, their generation, et cetera, but their emotional responses are so intense that they're the ones that cut off the child. How do you navigate that when you're the child who feels like I did not get the parent that I needed and my parent cuts me off? How do you deal with that? Did you guys know that I'm not only a therapist, but I'm also a coach and a professional tarot reader? Now, it's not exactly me hovering over a crystal ball telling your future. It's a way to connect with your guides on life issues such as career and love and spirituality. And sometimes people need one-on-one coaching to help them through breakups, toxic relationships, healing the mother wound, their spiritual path, or navigating tools as an empath. So I do all of these things to help my clients pursue life life and decisions and understand themselves. So if you are interested in one-on-one coaching or a tarot reading, click the link below to get started. Okay, back to the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, statistically, the adult child's more likely to be the one. But no, to your point, there are parents who cut the child off. Maybe they cut them off because of their gender identity or their sexuality or their politics, or they don't like who they married, or they don't like who they become. I mean, maybe they've cut them off also because they're severely mentally ill and impossible to spend time with, because they rage too much at the parent or something. But regardless, it's a very, sort of a repetition of the traumatic experiences that the child has already had with the parent. I mean, it's one thing to grow up in a household with an abusive parent, but then when the parent then later rejects you as a parent, that can be doubly wounding. So, I think that in those situations, the adult child, assuming that they've really given that parent a chance to repair or get on the same page with the adult child, and just to pause there to talk about that for a little bit, because sometimes the letters from the adult child might make it hard for the parent to meet them where they are. If you start off a letter saying, well, I've learned in therapy that you're a narcissist, or you're emotionally incestuous with me, or you're a gaslighter. I mean, as soon as you start calling somebody names, game over, right? Nobody likes to be called names that makes anybody defensive, parent or child. But if you were to start a letter to the parent saying, I'm writing to see if you're open to working on our relationship. There were many things that you did growing up that were really helpful to me that I'm grateful for. On the other hand, there were behaviors that occurred in the past that still occur in our relationship that I find really hurtful, that make it really hard to spend time with you. I'm wondering if you're open to doing therapy with me or having a discussion about it, a calm discussion about it. I would welcome that. So, I mean, that sort of sets the stage. Now, that doesn't mean that the parent's going to be able to meet them there in the same way that it doesn't mean that the most perfectly written amends letter from the parent's perspective is going to open the door to the adult child. But getting back to if the parent is unwilling and they just know you're a terrible person, you're a terrible kid, then I think that adult child has to grieve the loss and work on the ways that they've internalized those destructive messages, and and protect themselves from the ways that those destructive messages can be very insidious and destructive.
You talk about comfort avoidance in your book, and I would love for you to touch on that, because I do think that, as humans, when we're uncomfortable, when we anticipate a threat, right? We don't know if it's a bear coming at us versus, our mom who might reject us, right? All we know is our nervous system is like fight or flight. There's something happening. I don't like the way that this feels. I'd rather avoid. Let's avoid the conversation. Let's avoid the topic. Maybe we brush it under the rug and act like nothing ever happened, and the same thing happens over and over again. Or we avoid and we just go no contact. What is comfort avoidance? And is this hurting us more than it's helping us?
Yeah, I mean, there is, to your point, there's sort of healthy conflict avoidance. If it's like, if we're talking about the parent, you were just giving the example of a parent who's very rejecting and shaming and humiliating and destructive, then it's a healthy conflict avoidance because the person isn't really showing themselves capable of resolving the conflict, even if they're given all the tools. So that's kind of healthy conflict avoidance. Unhealthy conflict avoidance is just not having the ability to face the discomfort that happens when we challenge people that we love or want to feel more loved by or cared by, when we face them with the ways that we feel hurt or misunderstood or criticized or shamed. And because it feels so uncomfortable to have that conversation, either because we're caretakers and can't tolerate seeing that we've hurt somebody that we love, or we can't tolerate, not going the way that we want, then we don't have that conversation at all. And I think a certain percentages of estrangements happen in that space because the adult child either feels too scared of the parent, or they're too worried about hurting them. Something I see a lot with daughters and adult daughters and mothers. The daughter feels so caretaking of her mother that she doesn't want to hurt her, so she doesn't really tell her the things that really bother her about the relationship. And the reason it's important to think about is that, we know from all the research on cognitive behavior therapy that the things that you're the most afraid of are the things you should probably be facing and working through. And that, I think, to your point, anxiety can be like a dog that barks at everything. It evolved in us because it helped us to stay out of danger, but it also isn't a very good discriminator between real dangers and false dangers. So sometimes parents, being around them may trigger us in certain kinds of ways, but that doesn't mean that they're therefore terrible for us. It may be a signal that we have to work harder to become more immune to their criticisms or feelings or who they are, and preserve what's good about the relationship.
So what do you say to somebody who responds to that with, I don't want to give them the tools. They need to do that on their own. Why should I be the one responsible as the child to give my parents the tools to heal their relationship?
Right. No, I hear that a lot too. Well, yeah, I mean, because they may not know how to get the tools, and they may be unable to, for generational reasons, not even know what it is that the adult child's really wanting or needing. So to me, giving the parent the tools isn't, you're not really doing the work for them. You're just saying, here's a book I'd like you to read, or let's do family therapy, or, here's an example of what I feel is missing in our relationship and ways that you can respond in a different way. I mean, it's not like it's a selfless act. I mean, if the adult child is suffering in some way from the conflict in the relationship with the parent, it's a way to kind of put it on better footing potentially.
I like the idea of giving a book because for some people, maybe they're not at that point where they are willing or know how to write a letter. Maybe they don't have the words for it, or maybe it just feels too big, right? And so maybe a book can be a good start of like, here's a book that I found helpful. And I think that it might help us to understand each other more. And then it's up to them, right? Because they can choose to read the book, they can choose to not read it, and it's on them at that point. And I like the idea of that being kind of like a gateway into healing. So for parents that are trying to navigate that estrangement, you talk about new rules. So we mend the relationship, or we have a willingness to mend at least. What are the new rules, and what do people need to be aware of in order to keep that relationship at a level of healing and understanding?
Well, yeah, the new rules are really written for the parents because I think parents don't really understand how much the ground is shifted under their feet. So, one of the new rules is that your child doesn't owe you a relationship, that nothing compels your adult child to be in relationship with you beyond whether or not they want to be. And that means that you're going to have to be more empathic to the ways that they find difficult, that they find what's difficult in you, and then take responsibility. You can have to communicate in a more psychologically sophisticated way than perhaps you know how to do, and to learn how to do it. That's one. That spending time with your grandchildren is a privilege. It's not a right, so you can't insist on it. That threatening to take your child out of your will is typically not a good motivator. That telling your child that they had a better childhood than you did isn't going to feel particularly motivating to them. That criticizing your child's spouse or their therapist or the other parent, if there was a divorce, is also going to turn them away and make them feel misunderstood. And I think those are some of the ones that just come to mind right off the bat. I haven't read them lately, so I don't.
No, those are good ones. The power struggle, I think, is a real big one, at
Yeah.
least for me. And,
Sure.
and a lot of people that I've worked with, is that some parents, I feel like, especially from, different generations, have a really hard time letting go of that struggle of, I'm the parent, you're the child, and we'll use leverage, right? So I have found, and I'll just speak personally, as I got older, there was a leverage. Like, if you, okay, fine, I'm not going to do this for you, or I'm not going to watch your kid, or I'm not going to take you to this place when you're younger. Right. And as I became older and had more autonomy in my own life, and I no longer needed that as a trauma response, my hyper independence grew, because my hyper independence was my safety. Right. I can't depend on this person because I have to be able to provide for myself, because I don't want to have this taken away, because it's kind of like, oh, you don't want to listen? I'm not going to do that anymore. You learn from that pattern recognition. Okay, I'm going to depend on me. And as I've gotten older, that leverage is no longer there. And I have found that relationship very hard to maintain because that little, the minute a leverage is found, it's kind of dangled. Well, I'm not going to do this for you anymore. And it's like, okay, well, I don't need that anymore. So what are your messages to the parents out there, or even kids out there, adult children that are listening? Is like, yeah, I have to deal with that leverage a lot. Why doesn't it work? Why would you advise for or against it?
Well, it doesn't work because, we live in a highly individualistic culture where adult children are sort of taught to feel like their feelings are, and the relationship and how the relationship makes them feel is the most important thing. And so the idea of what they owe the parent isn't nearly as much in the foreground as it might be to other cultures. So, guilt, making your child feel guilty or like they owe it to you, it's just not going to be a motivator. That's why I say that nothing compels an adult child to be in contact beyond their desire to be in contact. And in the same way that we want to be in contact with our romantic partners or our friends, it's predicated upon the idea of, are they nice to me? Do they care about me? Are they interested? If they hurt my feelings, do they care about that? Are they willing to work on the communication? If we've had a communication misfire, it's the same principles now. And so the old days of, honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, no matter what they do, that's just not true anymore. And parents have to kind of get with the program.
I think a good word that comes to mind for me is transactional love. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like love should be transactional. And even if you grew up thinking like, oh, it must be transactional, I think for me, I've started to learn that it doesn't have to be. And when I feel like it does, that is where that avoidance comes in. Like, oh, nope, I'm feeling this power shift and this power dynamic. I don't like it. I'm going to avoid and I'm going to let it go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for people that want to mend this relationship, whether they're an adult child or they're the parent, and they're both willing, and there's maybe some transactional, leverage things going on, how do we start to have boundaries with not only our parents, but how do boundaries need to happen with the parents with the adult child? What does that look like?
Right. Well, it depends on kind of how motivated each party is to work on the relationship and salvage the relationship. I mean, I think if both parties are willing and able to do it, then and they're willing to communicate well or learn how to communicate well, I think, all these things can be kind of navigated. The issue is when one or both people don't know how to communicate well, then the power part just gets kind of dumped into the center of it because it's a more primitive way of engaging with the other person. It's sort of just making them feel bad if you don't do what they want. And I just don't think it's a great way to conduct a contemporary relationship. So let's say the parent feels like, well, you only call me when you want something, or you only reach out to me if you want financial help. And to the parent, that might feel kind of crappy. That may end up feeling used or hurt. Rather than telling the adult child that they're being usurious or mean or opportunistic or, taking advantage of them, it would be better to say, look, I love spending time with you and I don't mind helping you financially, assuming that they don't, but it has to occur in the context of a real relationship. I don't want it to be that the only time that we spend time together, you'd even call me as if you want just financial help. I do end up feeling like it's sort of transactional. I do end up feeling a little taken advantage of. Maybe that's not your intention. It probably isn't, but that is how I feel. So, can we talk about it? I mean, that would be a way so for the parent to kind of voice a complaint or a boundary to the adult child. And maybe the adult child in a different family would feel like, well, I feel like you're holding my help with my kids' school over my head, or paying for their piano lessons, and that you won't do that unless I talk to you much more than I feel like talking to you. Ideally, can we talk about that, or can we navigate that together? And the conflict provides the opportunity to deepen a relationship or to worsen it. And so ideally people have the tools to deepen it.
I think conflict is looked at by a lot of people as just innately bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're absolutely right. Conflict can deepen relationships, and there can be really great, healthy conflict.
Right.
I also think that people need to understand that boundaries doesn't innately mean rejection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Me putting a boundary does not mean I'm rejecting you. In
Right.
fact, it can be to preserve the relationship.
Right. Absolutely.
But it's up to you to state what your boundaries are and not make the assumption that the parent, the child, understands what those boundaries are. And it's up to you to uphold them, whatever that looks
Right.
like.
No, that's
That's like,
exactly
I
right.
think people go wrong there because
Yeah.
they expect my child should know this, my
Right.
parent should know this, right?
Hmm.
And then there's this conflict avoidance, and then
Right.
nothing gets solved.
No, exactly. And that's why not avoiding conflict is so important. It gives the person the opportunity to grow and to learn more about you. And it gives you the opportunity to advocate for yourself, which you may not be good at. And it really provides the opportunity to deepen the relationship. And if the communication goes south until to examine together, assuming both parties are motivated, we both need to work on our communication, figure out how to have better, more productive conversations, because it seems like these don't go well. And I want to understand why.
I have a weird question. Do
Weird
you
question.
find that in this field that you are really talking about this hard topic, do you get a lot of conflict with this? I'm just curious the feedback that you get from people.
Well, as you could imagine, a lot of the adult children don't like what I say. They feel like I don't get it that much directly, but I'll sometimes see comments on an article that I write, kind of like, oh, you're giving a pass to my narcissistic parents, or you're not, you're gaslighting traumatized children. And I don't actually think that's accurate, but I do sometimes get that feedback. Not always. I mean, I have a lot of adult children who've read my book or read an article and say, yeah, I think it could be helpful to me and my parents, or they'll send their parents my book. But yeah, but not everybody likes it. Not all parents like my work either. Like some parents complain is, well, why is it all up to me to heal the relationship? Why can't the child? They can write me an amends letter. I'm not going to write them an amends letter. I'm like, well, then I'm probably not the right person to help you, because that's not how I think about this. You're not going to get your kid back that way if that's your goal. If your goal is just to vent, sure, vent away, but it's not going to bring your child back to you.
I think that's how you're pushing the grain on something, right? Because when you start to get some like, ooh, what's he talking? Oh, this doesn't feel good. But I think that's how we make progress, right? It's not just seeing one side of the coin. I think we have to understand different perspectives to understand the whys. And here's what I tell people: it's not always about what's right and what's wrong. Sometimes it is, right? But it's what's effective. What's effective? What's your goal here? If your goal is to repair, then you not taking accountability and blame and to continue doing the same things you've been doing, it's not working and it's not going to get you what you want.
Yeah,
Bottom line.
exactly. No, that's right. You can be right or you can be happy, and you might not be able to be both. And for parents, I'm forever saying, don't get into the right or wrong of it. Just work to understand and show empathy and take responsibility. And you don't have to sign on to saying you were a bad, terrible parent. You're just signing on to saying, yeah, what the way that I treated you or treat you makes you feel like you can't feel safe around me or comfortable or open to me. And I need to take responsibility for that. We all have blind spots, both parents and children. So, on the parent side, they have to look at things that they might not be aware of.
What about siblings? So when we talk about estrangement, so Jimmy is no longer talking to mom, but Jimmy has three brothers and sisters who want to have a relationship with mom. Christmas comes along, Thanksgiving comes along, and obviously there's friction. What advice do you have for family members or siblings who are caught in the middle?
Yeah. Well, what I always tell parents is, that they can still have a relationship with the estranged sibling. They don't have to feel like they have to, not spend time with them to kind of as a show of loyalty. I also tell them to say that to the non-estranged sibling, your brother or your sister has these complaints about me or us. You might have the same complaints, or you might have different complaints, but I don't want you to feel like, because it's hurtful to us that your sibling is estranged, that you have to sort of represent my self-esteem as a parent. So, I'm open to hearing your complaints as well. I don't think parents should have the non-estranged siblings serve as their voice or their mouthpiece, or to sort of try to encourage them to encourage the adult child to reconcile or sort of be a spy on what they're thinking or feeling. I think those are sort of the biggest principles.
Let's talk about triangulation a little bit, though, because I feel like that does happen a lot. So let's say the estrangement hasn't happened yet, or maybe it has, and Jimmy now decides, you know what, fine, for the sake of peace, I'm willing to come to Christmas. And mom is like, oh yeah, see, Jimmy just always does that. Don't you think so? And really tries to triangulate to get people on mom's side. Why is that damaging, and why would you advise against that?
Well, because sometimes people will have a family friend reach out to the estranged child or the sibling, or maybe it's a, revered grandparent, and the estranged child just feels misunderstood and ganged up on. And I've never seen it work. So I never encourage people to try to pressure, or even in a loving way, advocate for the parents or the estranged person, because that person just feel misunderstood or ganged up on or criticized or shamed. So I think people just have to work on that relationship themselves and not expect somebody else to be able to solve it for them, even though it's understandable that they wish they could.
I think triangulation gets roped up with like narcissism. And while that is a very classic feature of narcissism, it doesn't innately mean that someone's a narcissist. But I do want to say that, triangulation does no one any favors, right? And I get some people are looking for the validation to feed into, see, I'm right. I'm valid with how I feel. And if I get this person and this person to take my side, that means I'm not the problem and it's you that's the problem. But it doesn't get you the relationship. It doesn't solve the problem. It just alienates the person more and says, see, this is why I can't deal with you, right? It's reinforces everyone's behavior. So if you're listening out here, don't triangulate.
No, right. And in fact, I encourage parents to do the opposite, rather than talk about how mad they are or upset with family. I mean, they can talk about those feelings, but not in a way that invalidates that estranged adult child's perspective. Because if somebody's not estranged from that adult child, they may tell that adult child what's being said. And if the parents are representing the adult child's perspective in a more compassionate light to the family, that may also get passed on to that adult child, may make them feel more hopeful about the parent than if they hear, yeah, your parents were really criticizing you and saying you're being really selfish and mean and cruel and they don't understand it. That's not going to create the environment where the adult child's going to want to come back. Whereas if they hear, well, your parents are confused, but they told me that they're willing to do family therapy and they're sad about it, but they also, so that they assume you have your reasons. And so they're not criticizing you. That's a very different, kind of communication.
So if you had to give one piece of advice out there for people who are listening, let's divide this into two populations: estranged adult children and estranged adult parents. What is the one thing that you want each of them to understand? If you had to, there's so many things you can say, but if you had to give one piece of advice to each person, which one, what would it be?
Well, for parents, it's to give up. I mean, it's probably not one piece. It's sort of a little cluster of advice, but it would be to show empathy, take responsibility, find the kernel, if not the bushel of truth in your child's complaints, and reach out to them from that perspective, and to know that they wouldn't be doing this unless they felt like it was the healthiest thing for them to do. So that would be my advice to parents. With a estranged adult child, it would be that, maybe you do need to be estranged for a while, but consider opening the door again after, a year or something, or 6 months or whatever. For some parents, estrangement can be a big wake-up call. And so if they've had a period of being completely out of contact with their adult child, they may be more open to doing the kind of changes that the parent wasn't able to do before. And to see the parent as, parents really do the best that they can. And in some ways, it's not their fault that they parented in a way that was hurtful to you. It's not your fault either as the adult child. But from that perspective, parents deserve a certain degree of compassion and an opportunity to work to heal the things that were hurtful.
Dr. Coleman, thank you so much for your wisdom and, just the work that you do, because we do need to have other perspectives. We need to have resources that are out there, especially for those that are willing to do some work to make changes. If people don't have any resources or don't have a place for that, they're not going to change. So what you do is so important. And I hope that any parents that are listening out there that are listening and saying to themselves, like, actually, I really want to write that letter. I really want to try to make amends. I hope that the work that you do helps them to do that. And so thank you for what you do on camera, off camera, behind the scenes. And thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate you.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.